Well, there's a lot on economic policy that has been promised by the Congress in its 55-page manifesto. Joining us now to discuss the implications of the Congress's promises, Salman Soz. Salman Soz, many thanks for joining us here. As I pointed out, there's a lot of emphasis on economic policy and economic matters in the Congress manifesto. Let me start by asking you about how you intend to fund all of this. I mean, the Nyay scheme, for instance, over 3 lakh crores over 5 years. You talk about 6% of GDP. That's the spending on education. You talk about 3% on healthcare. Where is the money to fund all of these promises going to come from? If, of course, you are voted to power.
Well, first of all, when we look at all this, all the promises that we made and all the funding questions that come up, I think people immediately jump to doing calculations about, okay, Nyay is going to cost 72,000 rupees per year, 5 crore families, 3.5 lakh crores, and look at the GDP right now, and it's 2% of GDP, and they do similar calculations for other things. What we are saying is that in the case of Nyay, for example, and even in the case of the education budget, for example, these will be delivered over time. These are to be staggered. This is going to be done in phases. We're not saying that the education budget is going to be at 6% of GDP within by the end of 2019.
Right.
I think the date for that is, I think it's going to be done over 5 years. So we're going to reach that over time. I think this has been a long-standing issue because we're not spending enough on education. So what we are doing is we're making promises that we hope and will also rev up the economy. Certainly, Nyay has great potential to come in as a fiscal stimulus for the poor, because they've been really beaten down by demonetization, GST, really poor farm prices. So you revive that side, and because of consumption through Nyay, you will have lots of private sector kind of business revving up. That is going to feed into the economy. That's going to increase your GDP, which is the denominator for any fiscal calculation.
Okay, let me break up each of those issues that you raised, and let's focus on Nyay for just a little bit longer. The manifesto does talk about the fact that it will be rolled out in phases. It says the estimate cost will be less than 1% of GDP in year 1 and less than 2% of GDP in year 2 and thereafter. It also says that this will be a joint scheme of the central and state governments. It then goes on to talk about how the scheme will be funded through new revenues and the rationalizations of current expenditure. So can you explain to me, when you talk about this being a joint scheme, because this was something that Arvind Subramaniam had spoken of as well, he had talked about 6,000 rupees from the central government, 6,000 rupees a matching grant from the state government. Is that how you envisage this happening?
No, I think what we are planning to do is, of course, the states will have to participate. I think that is very important. After all, this is a federal polity, and we all have to pitch in. But I suspect the bulk of the funding, or at least the majority of it, is likely to come from the central government. But that is why when we go into the design phase for this particular scheme, the first 3 months, we've got to really go through the nuts and bolts and start designing. Then we need to do some piloting of this scheme, and then we start rolling it out. Remember, this is the same way we did in Narega. And by the way, this is the way economic policy making should be. It should not be that one fine day you wake up and you tell people that, we're going to stop, we're going to take swap all currency out of the system, because that is disruptive. We don't want disruption. We want a very stable framework, because that is what India needs. We need to ultimately get growth to double digits. If we don't do that, we cannot create the kinds of jobs we want for our young people.
Salman.
But in order to do that, we need schemes like this so that we lift people up who are at the very bottom.
No, I understand, and I appreciate the fact that you want to do pilots to be able to test the concept itself. But I'm still trying to get clarity, because again, I go back to your manifesto, and it talks about the fact that current merit subsidy schemes that don't achieve any specific objectives will probably be discontinued. Now, has there been any thought so far on the current subsidy schemes that work, and what are the new ways of raising revenue? Are we talking about a super rich tax? Are we talking about higher taxes in general? There's one line basically on progressive taxation. That's all that I could find specifically. But what is the idea there in terms of new revenue raising measures?
Well, look, I mean, let's just talk about the subsidies for a moment, right? I mean, what we are suggesting is, no, not suggesting, what we are saying is that core merit subsidies will not be touched. There are wonderful schemes out there that we cannot and will not touch because they're really helping the needy. Then there are, if you look at the number of schemes that we have in the government, there must be close to 1,000 central government schemes. We have to take a hard look at those things and say, okay, we've got to rationalize where we can. That's one. Second, if you notice, one of the things that has come out very clearly in this manifesto is that we will be disinvesting from all public central government enterprises that are not core or strategic in nature, and quite frankly, there are quite a few of them. So I don't want to get into, obviously this is the manifesto, and ultimately the details are, when you have governance, then you start detailing things out. But you want to provide the broad framework. In fact, we are saying that we're going to disinvest. Okay. And it is clearly marked now that as long as you're not core or strategic, we're going to disinvest from. Which is a big too. I mean, there's a lot of ways one can raise funds.
Sure, but since you talked about strategic disinvestment, let me pick that up, because this is a departure from both UPA 1 and UPA 2, where you stayed away from strategic disinvestment. So this is clearly a shift in strategy. Now, when you talk about non-core and non-strategic PSUs that could be up for strategic disinvestment, what does that mean exactly? What is non-core? Is an airline non-core? Is it non-strategic? Are steel companies non-core, non-strategic? What are we talking about? Because remember, this government has promised strategic disinvestment. Many have been cleared by cabinet, but none have gone through.
But I cannot speak for this government because they made a mess of the economy. What I can tell you is that, look, I can't really get into the specifics of we're going to take this, they take this PSU and disinvest from there or that. I think that would not be appropriate at this time. But the fundamental compact with the people of India is that we are not going to give up on fiscal prudence. We are on target to 3% of GDP as fiscal deficit for 2021. That is our target. How can we match that if we don't have, ultimately you can either raise revenues or you can cut. You can raise revenues through a variety of sources, and you can cut expenditures in some areas. If we do both of them, and I think then the pain will be less.
Since you talked about the fiscal deficit, and that does figure in your manifesto where you talk about 3% by 2020-21. And I think, that's where the concern lies, because it was in UPA 2 where there were really concerns on the UPA 2 writing checks that it could not afford to write. And that seems to be the concern that's back in the market with respect to all the many promises that you've made, whether it's NREGS going from 100 to 150 days, or it's the Nyai scheme, or it's education and healthcare. The question is, how are you going to manage the fisc? And you haven't done a particularly great job in your previous tenure, specifically UPA 2.
But if you think about what happened in UPA 2, you've got to go back to the global financial crisis and what that did, and what kind of a stimulus we had to put in. And by the way, people call us reckless for that fiscal stimulus. Think of what China did. Think of what the US did. Their fiscal stimulus was huge compared to what India did. But even so, that did have a huge impact on us. There's no question about it. But we were trying to kind of make sure that we don't fall off the cliff. And we did not fall off the cliff. If you remember, we still maintained high growth. Yes, the fiscal deficit was a problem at that time, as was inflation. But over time, and in fact, by the way, look at that. I mean, look at how the economy was also growing. In nominal terms, it was growing very fast. In real terms, despite the inflation, it was growing fast, much faster than these guys have, grown the economy. So I think I don't say that your concerns are not valid. Of course, valid concerns. At the same time, we are committed, based on, hopefully there will be no tragedy like the global financial crisis. That's the steady state. In the steady state, I think this is easily doable, I think. Easily.
Okay, you think that it's easily doable. I still have a lot of questions there, but let me focus on the GST. Let me focus on the GST, Salman, because again, that's a long list of promises that the Congress has made. One, you talk about the fact that you want to bring in a revenue neutral rate, one single standard revenue neutral rate. You talk about a demerit rate, and then you talk about a lot of items like food, life-saving drugs, vaccines, etc., which will be either zero rated or exempt from GST. What is the standard rate likely to be? What do you believe it should be?
Well, I personally believe it should be certainly below 15%. That's what I believe. I think it should be way below where we are right now. The reason for that is very simple to my mind. because indirect taxes have now become a bigger share of our tax revenue, and direct taxes have fallen. That is not the way India should be moving. India should, because indirect taxes are hugely regressive. They're a huge tax on poor people. Well, how can we do this? We've got to get out of this situation where indirect taxes are such a big part of our tax collection. So I think GST, in my opinion, if it were to be brought down, it should be below 15%. That is my view. I don't know what the exact rate is going to be. Our experts will have to sit with economists, a panel of economists, and they'll figure it out. But no matter what you say, the current tax system is just not tenable. The current GST is horrible. It has actually imposed a cost on this economy, and we're going to do away with it. Now, what we want is compliance. You don't encourage compliance by kind of going through tax terrorism and high rates and complexity. You want to simplify. That is what we're trying to do.
Let me then, and there's a bunch of things that you talk about in terms of what will be added onto the GST net and so on and so forth. Along expected lines, we haven't seen that happen so far. But, I want to go back to what seems like an old wine in new bottle when you talk about industry and growing the share of manufacturing to 25% of GDP. I cannot remember how many times we have spoken of this very same target through the tenure of the UPA and through the tenure of this government as well. And we're still hovering at 16% of GDP. So, there's a big question mark on when we'll be able to get to that 25% at all. But, you talk about these export-only zones. Is that the special economic zones repackaged?
No, let me just say this on the manufacturing output and this aspiration to get to 25%. You're right. I mean, it's a very, very difficult task to do. But in this manifesto, what we're trying to do is something different. What we are saying is we've got to unleash the private sector.
How?
If you look at our proposal for MSMEs,
how do you intend to do that? You've talked about no permissions for the first 3 years to start a business. Give me specifics on how do you intend to unleash the animal spirits?
So think about it this way. Even before your entrepreneur is setting things up, even before this person can make a single dime, you're after his life to do this paperwork, to do that paperwork, to pay this tax, to pay that tax. And there's a reason people are unable to get businesses going. There's a reason our MSME sector is very, very small. If you compare our MSMEs to Chinese and MSMEs from other places, ours are tiny. There is a disincentive to grow. You want to stick around in your small little thing so that you don't have to meet any of these inspectors and all that.
Salman Soz, the problem there is one of land acquisition. In fact, in your manifesto, you talk about going back to the land acquisition policy that the UPA had, and you say the deviations from that should in fact be done away with. How are you going to create these Chinese-style SEZs if you don't have a land acquisition policy that works?
Look, I mean, the land acquisition policy that was notified on January 1, 2014, we haven't really, I mean, before we could do anything with it, the Prime Minister came out with these land ordinances, and ultimately he had to back off, and he said, no, I'm not going to do it. And he's left everything in a limbo. We want to bring in some policy certainty to it. Once you bring policy certainty, then you can get things going. I think that's, in my view, policy certainty more than anything else is important. Second, when I talk about the MSME sector, we're not talking about these people going and buying tracts of land or something. They could be anybody starting any kind of activity on the internet, sitting in their homes, doing whatever they want to do. They just don't need permission from me or you or anybody else. They just can get on with their work, make some money, maybe grow a little bit and employ somebody. That's what we want.
That's separate from starting a special economic zone, which is the question that I was asking you to boost manufacturing. But on the other issue of the banking sector, and you talk about reforms within the PSBs, you're going along with what this government has already stated, which is to bring the banking sector, the public sector, down to about 6 to 8 large national banks. So in that, there is complete agreement from the current policy. If voted to power, you intend to continue with that?
Well, I mean, just because we are going to defeat one party in the election doesn't mean that everything that they're doing is terrible. I mean, but for the most part, I think that they failed. But there are certain things that they've done that we would want policy continuity on. And by the way, that is not very different from what they did. They did not do away with Narega. They built on the Aadhaar platform. So I think this is part of governance. We can't just say, okay, now Modi was here and now everything he did was we'll just finish it. That's not the way we should do it.
Growth, Salman, and I want to talk a little bit about growth, because while in the chapter on macros, you talk about fiscal deficit, you talk about gross capital formation, you talk about the savings target of 40% of GDP, there's no growth number there.
There's no growth number there, but I think the aspiration, frankly, should be for India, whether or not it is in the Congress Party's manifesto. I think we've got to try and shoot for double-digit growth, because right now, you see it, I see it. This growth does not look like 7 to 7.5%. It does not feel like that. I mean, you have investments right now. I don't know what it was a 14-year low or something. I just saw some article today. We are suffering. I mean, the economy is suffering. We've got to have revival. We've got to have a revival in this economy, and we can't really. And the thing is that if you aspire for 7% growth or 8% growth and think that somehow that is going to create amazing number of jobs out here, I think that is misplaced. I think we need. Because our GDP is still relatively low. GDP per capita is very, very low. We have lots of space to grow. I think we should keep our eyes on double-digit growth. I know that the Congress Party has not put that specific number there, but that doesn't mean that we don't aspire for, and everybody else shouldn't aspire for double-digit growth.
A very quick last question, Salman. As I pointed out, that the manifesto is has a lot of emphasis on the economy, on the economic promises that the Congress intends to make to voters to woo them ahead of 2019. But the narrative, at least the narrative that the government has been able to paint so far, which seems to resonate as well, is around national security. Do you believe that this is going to be enough to swing voters?
National security is something that every government cares about. No matter what government is in place, we have our armed forces, we have our national security apparatus, and India will remain secure. So I don't think, I think people understand that. The people understand that the armed forces do not belong to any particular party. They love their country. They'll do whatever they will for this government or the next government. They're doing it for India. So I think what people then are looking at is, okay, if everybody has the same national security apparatus, what exactly are they going to do? As far as I'm concerned, if I'm a young person, if I'm a farmer, if I'm a poor person tilling a farm, if I'm an MSME owner, if I'm an entrepreneur who has higher ambitions, what is the government likely to do for me? I think one thing that I think that is really good about this manifesto is that it really kind of places the private sector at front and center in the growth story. And that is where I think we need to be. Public sector focuses on public goods, and that is very important, education and health and railways and defense and things like that. But the private sector is going to run ahead, and I think that is how you're going to create jobs. That's how you create opportunities, and I think that's what will resonate with people.
All right. Thanks very much for joining us, Salman Soz, to take us through the Congress manifesto. Appreciate your time.